I don't typically begin my presentations with music, but I'm making an exception this time because I think that this piece of music, which is from a Greek artist, just encapsulates lots of the themes that we'll be dealing with tonight. The beauty of springtime, with the earth bursting with life, birds flying, colorful flowers, rushing water, and the vibrancy of nature in springtime. So I'm going to begin with some music by Yanni, and I kindly ask that we all mute yourselves, please, so that we do not disturb anyone's enjoyment of it. So I've structured the event in three parts. First, we're going to talk about the gods we're dealing with, and then we're going to talk about the myth, and then we'll talk about the mysteries themselves. So now let's meet the characters of tonight. So the first is the goddess Demeter. I'm told that in proper Greek, it's pronounced Demeter, but I haven't got the flow of that, so tonight I'll just stick with Demeter. So she was the daughter of Rhea and Cronus, and one of the six original Olympians, just known as the goddess of grain, of nourishment, fertility, vegetation, all fruits apart from beans, the harvest, sacred law, the cycle of life and death, agriculture, famine, and the fertile top layer of the earth's crust where seeds grow. And she was also partially a goddess of the underworld, because when seeds are buried in the earth, they must die before they can grow. And so there's also the agrarian belief that all life comes from the remains of a dead thing. And so a dead body in ancient Greek was actually known as Demetrioi, the people of Demeter. And the Spartans called her Demeter Chthoniya, because Chthoniya is suggestive of the underworld. Her brothers were Zeus and Poseidon and Hades. People call him Hades, but I'm told the proper Greek pronunciation is Hades. And her sisters were Hera and Hestia. And some of the epithets that she was known by, especially in prayers or in poetry, were bringer of the seasons, earth mother, giver of goodly gifts, lovely haired, all nourishing, bestower of splendid gifts, bright goddess, queen amongst goddesses, giver of wealth, glorious noble goddess, Chrysaorus, which means lady of the golden blade. And this particular one had a twofold meaning. There was the golden blade or golden sword that she used during the War of the Giants, but that's a story for another day. And then also the golden sickle, which she used to harvest the first crops of wheat. And in art, she's often depicted carrying two torches. More on that later. Now, amongst the gods on Olympus, incest was quite often. And so according to the legend, Demeter and her brother Zeus, the king of the gods, mated in the form of two intertwining snakes. And from this union, her daughter Kore was born. Her daughter Kore, who would later be known as Proserpina or Persephone. Demeter actually had 7 children in total. They were Plutus, Philomulus, Despina, Arion, Corbias, Persephone, and Chrysothemis. She had her own palace on Mount Olympus, and she typically traveled in a chariot that was drawn by 2 winged snake-like dragons called Draconis in Greek. And they were also her security detail. Some of the sacred animals and totems associated with this goddess were the serpent, the most sacred of her totems, which is why they're the ones that transported her. Serpents were creatures which represented rebirth in nature because they shed their old skins. They're symbols of transformation, immortality, and healing. Then there's the gecko, because according to the legend, while she was grieving her daughter Persephone, she barely ate or drank anything. But then she went to this town in Attica, and a woman named Misme offered her a drink. And because she was starving, she was gulping it down. And then Misme's son Ascalibus mocked her and called her a glutton. And in her anger, Demeter threw the rest of her drink at the boy and turned him into a gecko. So don't be rude, kids. Then there's also the swine, one of her other sacred totems. Pigs were customarily sacrificed to Demeter to ensure the fertility of the earth. And we'll discuss that more later in the presentation. Then also the turtle dove. Turtle doves were an animal calendar marker, because their breeding season starts in April and May and lasts till about September, October. So it overlaps perfectly with the grain harvest season. And apparently in ancient times, animal calendar markers were quite common. And then there's the red mullet fish, which is supposedly very fertile and gives birth 3 times a year. And then her sacred plants were wheat, barley, mint, and the poppy. All these plants were used in the rituals that we'll discuss later. The poppy flowers were commonly found growing among the grain of the wheat. And the poppy is commonly associated with images of Demeter, because she supposedly used them to get over her grief over her daughter Persephone. So just how powerful was this goddess? Let's see what it may have been like to witness her power in action. I kindly ask that we all mute ourselves, please, so we don't interrupt anyone else's enjoyment. So now we're going to move on to Hades, sometimes pronounced Hades. He was the god of the dead, king of the underworld, god of all the hidden wealth in the earth, that is gold, silver, and all other minerals, probably also petroleum, and even the fertile soil that nourished seeds. He presided over funerals and defended the rights of dead things to having funerals. Also an original Olympian, and some of the epithets he was known by are Zeus of the underworld, the host of many, receiver of the dead, lord of the temple of Pluton, Necron Sota, savior of the dead. And in art, he's often depicted as a stern, bearded god standing beside his three-headed dog, Cerberus. And Cerberus was the giant hound that guarded the gates of the underworld and prevented its inhabitants from escaping. It supposedly had a lion's claws, a serpent's tail, and a mane made of snakes, and it was a ferocious beast. He lived, Hades that is, lived in a golden palace deep in the underworld and received the newly dead, along with 3 judges on his golden throne. He drove a golden chariot drawn by a team of 4 immortal sable black horses. He controlled his chariot with a magic helm that made him, or whoever was riding it, completely invisible, even to other gods. And he also wielded a golden scepter with which he could split the earth open whenever he wanted to move between worlds. He had an orchard of pomegranate trees that grew next to his palace as well. And he also had a large stable filled with immortal horses and also sable black cattle, and he also, of course, held the keys to his kingdom, which he kept locked, also made from gold. And the sacred animals, totems, and plants associated with Hades are the screech owl, which was known as the messenger of Hades and was a bird of bad omens. Apparently, it used to be a person who looked after his pomegranate orchard, person known as Ascalaphos. And his sacred plants were the cypress, which was a tree of mourning. Secret Hades because its aromatic branches presumably used to mask the smell of death. There was also the white poplar tree, because there's a story that Zeus also kidnapped the most beautiful nymph, a minor nature goddess known as Loke. Apparently, it was a thing with him. He kidnapped lots of muses and nymphs and such. And she was a daughter of Oceanus, and she was abducted by Hades. And after her death, he turned her into a white poplar tree. And then also mint. Mint apparently used to be a concubine of Hades until she was turned into a mint plant by Demeter and Persephone. And now next we're moving to the goddess Persephone, or Kore, as she was born. So Kore means the maiden or the girl. She's the goddess of spring, queen of the underworld, and also the goddess of vegetation. She was so closely associated with her mother that they were often referred to as the two Demeters, or the two goddesses. And with her husband, Hades, she also presided over necromancy, communication with the dead. She's also known as the goddess of curses. And some of the epithets she was known by include the mistress, the pure one, bringer of fruit, great goddess, exactor of justice, the holy one, the venerable one. And her sacred plant was the asphodel, a flower symbolic of peace after death and the afterlife. And in art, she's often portrayed holding a pomegranate, which is emblematic of her marriage to Hades. And sometimes she's depicted carrying a cornucopia, the horn of plenty, which is a symbol of abundance, of good fortune, or of a bountiful harvest. And in Greek legend, the cornucopia refers to a horn of a goat from Crete named Amalthea, which fed Zeus, the father of the gods, in his infancy. And Zeus accidentally broke off one of her horns, and she filled that broken horn with gifts and offered it up to Zeus. And Zeus was so pleased that he endowed that horn with the power to be filled with whatever the owner of the horn desired. And Zeus also loved this goat so much that he placed her amongst the stars in the constellation Capra, which we know as Capricorn, because of course in Latin, Capra is the word for goat. And now we're moving on to the myth itself. So the myth we're concerned with tonight is about the abduction of Cora, the goddess, and her transformation into Persephone. But it's always referred to as the rape of Persephone because it's implied that that's what Hades did to her after he abducted her. And this story, the only full account you find of it is contained in the ancient Greek text known as the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which was written in the 7th century, like around 675 BC to 625 BC. It was written by an unknown poet, but it is attributed to Homer. And it provides the earliest evidence of the worship of Demeter and Persephone. And the first verse of this poem is, or hymn is, I begin to sing of Demeter, the holy goddess with the beautiful hair, and her daughter Persephone too, the one with the delicate ankles whom Hades seized. So Kore was an exceptionally beautiful goddess, the young goddess, the daughter of Zeus and Demeter. And in ancient Greece, a woman had no say in who she married. Like in most ancient cultures, it was the way it was. And so her Kyrios, her guardian, her master, or her lord, usually her father, made the arrangements for her marriage with her husband to be. And it was not necessary to consult the mother of the girl. This was common in most parts of the ancient world. And so without Demeter's knowledge, Zeus had given Hades permission to marry his daughter, Kore. So as far as ancient Greece was concerned, it was a perfectly legal marriage. And Hades had fallen in love with her. So he did the only reasonable thing that any man in love would do. He kidnapped her. And again, kidnapping is something that was commonly done in most ancient civilizations. Wife kidnapping was practiced and accepted by society. And it's still practiced actually in Kyrgyzstan till this day, even though it's been outlawed. And also in ancient Greek customs, there was a symbolic kidnapping done as part of the wedding rites in some parts of ancient Greece. And it was called hand on wrist and symbolized the transfer of power over the bride from her father to her husband. And it primarily consisted of the groom taking the bride by the wrist and leading her to her new home. But none of these grooms had as much style as Hades. So the story goes that on a beautiful day, the goddess Kore was out and about in a beautiful meadow with her friends. And her bevy of friends were all nymphs and daughters of Okeanos. Okeanos was the god of rivers and all fresh water, be it wells or rain clouds or springs. And his daughters, they all adored Kore. And so they were in the plain of Nysa. And some versions see that they were painting all the flowers in the world. And some versions see that they were simply picking flowers. And no one else was really out and about. It was just she and her friends and, just having wonderful time. But there was a man somewhere looking after a herd of pigs. And so Kore and her friends are there running around in the meadow, giggling and picking different flowers. They mostly picked irises, crocuses, violets, hyacinths, and roses. Now, this may or may not be significant, but most of the flowers they're picking were purple. And apparently in ancient Greece, purple was the color of bridal gowns, and they wore a purple gown with a red veil over their heads. Anyway, so they're picking the flowers, and then her eyes were suddenly drawn to the most beautiful flower she had ever seen. It was called a narcissus, which is a daffodil. But this particular one was so beautiful that it created a feeling of holy awe in all people who beheld it. Anyone who gazed upon it was just in awe, whether they were mortals or immortals. And it also had a very intoxicating fragrance, and it had like 100 different radiant heads growing from the one root, and seemed as if she was in a trance as she walked towards it. And then she reached out with both her hands to touch it. When out of nowhere, the ground opened up under her, and Hades popped out from the ground with his chariot pulled by immortal horses. And he grabbed her as she and her friends screamed in terror. He put her in his chariot and then descended back into the underworld. Some of the grazing pigs around on the meadow also fell back into the chasm that opened up. And then the ground closed up behind her and she was gone. So as she was falling in to the underworld, she called out to her father Zeus to help her. But her dad, he was out at a temple somewhere, sitting apart from all the other gods. And he was receiving very beautiful sacrificial rites from humans. And so he didn't hear her. And as she screamed, her mother didn't hear her, but her voice echoed on all the mountaintops. and in the depths of all the oceans. And so her mother only heard the echoing of her voice as she was going into the underworld. Now, not many people were around, but two gods witnessed what had happened. And they were Hecate, the goddess of magic, the goddess of doorways and crossroads, and also Helios, the god of the sun. And so when Demeter heard her daughter scream, she ripped her diadem or her crown off of her head, and great panic took over her, and she put on a dark cloak and went into just in a state of absolute terror. And she went flying all over the world looking for her daughter, like a bird of prey, looking everywhere, asking everyone questions, but no one will tell her anything. And so for 9 days, Demeter wandered all over the earth with blazing torches and in a dark cloak, as which is often depicted. She didn't eat anything, she didn't drink anything, she didn't bathe for that entire time. And then on the 10th day, Hecate came to her also holding a torch in her hand. And Hecate said to Demeter, "Lady Demeter, bringer of the seasons and giver of splendid gifts, which one of the gods in the sky or immortal humans seized Persephone and brought grief to your heart? I heard the sounds, but I did not see it with my eyes." Demeter didn't respond, but she just followed Hecate, and together they went looking for Helios, the god of the sun, because he's considered the seeing eye of all gods and of all men. He always saw everything that happened. And so Demeter went and stood in front of his chariot and asked him to tell her the truth, god to goddess. And Helios responded, "Queen Demeter, you shall know the answer, for I greatly respect you and feel sorry for you as you grieve your child, the one with the delicate ankles. No one else among the immortals is responsible except the cloud gatherer Zeus himself, who gave her to Hades as his beautiful wife." But after Helios told her this, he asked her to calm down, because after all, her daughter was now the queen of a very wealthy kingdom and goddess of the underworld. Because in ancient Greece, the world was divided into three parts. So it was the heavens, ruled over by Zeus, the oceans, ruled over by Poseidon, and the underworld, ruled over by Hades. And he was a very, very wealthy god. And then, of course, after telling her to calm down, he sped off in his chariot. Demeter was furious. Like, she was even more heartbroken than she was before, because she realized what had happened to her daughter. Because if her daughter had been kidnapped and married off, then obviously she'd been raped by Hades. That's the reason why it's referred to as the rape of Persephone. So she was in a state of grief. She just abdicated all her duties as the god of vegetation, of the seasons, and just went into grief. Now, in the Borghese Museum and Gallery in Rome, there's a marble sculpture by Bernini that depicts this incident. And we're going to see a little clip about that. I ask again that you please mute yourself so we don't interrupt anybody's enjoyment. Thank you.
We're in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, looking at an important, very early sculpture by Bernini.
This is Pluto and Persephone. This is a bit of a difficult subject. Pluto, who rules over Hades, the land of the dead, is shown here abducting the beautiful Persephone.
She's the daughter of Zeus and Demeter. Demeter is associated with life, with the growth of the fields, with nature.
With crops, with fertility.
And she's devastated by the loss of her daughter.
But a deal is struck. Persephone only spends half the year in the underworld and the other half of the year here on Earth.
A fanciful explanation for why crops grow only in the warm months. Although the sculptural group is now in the middle of a room, the sculpture was originally placed very close to a wall and is really meant to be seen from the front.
I find this to be a difficult sculpture when I first look at it because my eye goes immediately to Pluto. And the grin on his face as he's abducting Persephone feels very distasteful.
Especially in contrast to Persephone, who is rendered so beautifully. And she looks as if she is truly repulsed by him. She doesn't want to touch him.
She's using her left hand to push his forehead away, but she curls her fingers away. She doesn't want to lay her entire hand on his body. Even her toes seem tensed up as she tries to resist him.
But probably the most striking aspect of the sculpture for me is the way Pluto's fingers press into her thigh. And the artist demonstrates the elasticity of flesh, but in hard, cold stone. This is marble. This is magic.
This is what Bernini could do best. He could make marble appear to be flesh or feathers or hair or the bark of a tree. He could transform marble into almost any material.
This sculpture began as a block, and the artist chisels and drills to remove the unnecessary stone. But this sculpture is so delicate, it almost seems as if it's made the way a bronze sculpture is made. That is, it was built up in clay or wax. So delicate and so fine are the details.
That's especially true with her hair that flies back. It is as though he's modeled that in some soft material.
Or the cloth that almost like a corkscrew spins behind her.
Here we are in the 1600s. This is the Baroque era. The movement that we see here, this caught moment in time, is part of what makes this Baroque in style.
It would be impossible for these figures to hold their position for more than one moment in time. Look at Pluto. Both of his legs are flexed. Those knees are bent. His body is so unstable. He must be in motion. He must be moving forward. This lacks all of the stability of the High Renaissance.
The composition seems to be in the shape of an X, of two intersecting diagonal lines. As soon as you have a diagonal, you have a sense of movement and instability.
The idea of movement is even expressed in the dog that guards Hades, Cerberus, whose three heads almost seem as if they might be one head in motion. And I love the fact that Bernini has sculpted the eye of one of the dog heads as a spiral.
Speaking of instability, Pluto's weight is really carried just on that forward foot, on his left foot, and the right foot is up, and he's just on the ball of his foot and three of his toes. This is incredibly unstable.
He seems to be in the process of hoisting her up.
And she's in the process of pushing him away. We have conflicting desires here. This is not a movement in unison. This is a conflict.
But this is also an exercise in the beauty of the human body, in the beauty of form. Bernini was a deeply religious man in a deeply religious culture. But this is not in any way a religious drama. This is mythology. This is speaking to the cultured status of the man who commissioned this.
And the continued importance of ancient Greek and Roman culture, even here in the Baroque era.
So after this, Demeter felt so betrayed that she disguised herself as a mortal woman and went into hiding as a human to grieve her daughter. She abandoned her duties as a goddess, and plants started dying, the seasons, there was no one to regulate them. She came to a town known as Eleusis, or Eleusina, as it's called now, and decided to rest there. And she sat down under the shade of an olive tree beside a well known as Callicoron. That's a picture of the well. Now, the king of Eleusis had 4 daughters, and they went to fetch water from the well, and they saw this sad old woman sitting there, and they asked her who she was, and Demeter told them that her name was Dosso, and that she'd been kidnapped by pirates, and she just managed to escape, and that she was stranded, and she begged them to help her find a job anywhere if they could. And so they asked her to wait by the well, and they would go back and ask permission from their mom to see if they could give her a job. Their mom, Queen Metanira, she'd just given birth to her first boy, and she was looking for a nursemaid. So when the daughters went to her, she agreed. And so the girls rushed back to the well, and they brought Demeter to the palace. And as Demeter was walking in through the doors, through the threshold of the doorway, her disguise slipped for just a brief moment, and her divine light filled the entire doorway. It was just for a second, and then her disguise came back on. But the queen noticed it, and she was in such awe that she got up and offered Demeter the throne she'd been sitting on. But Demeter wouldn't sit there. And then this old woman named Iambe, she's known now as the goddess of mirth and laughter. That's how she is portrayed. So this woman named Iambe brought in a stool and threw a fleece of a ram over it. And this time Demeter sat down, but she wouldn't speak, she wouldn't move, she wouldn't eat, or she wouldn't drink anything she was offered. And then that Iambe noticed how miserable Demeter looked, and she started teasing her and making jokes, and she succeeded in making Demeter smile and laugh for the very first time ever since her daughter had gone missing. Then Queen Metanera offered Demeter a cup of red honey wine, but Demeter refused to drink it on religious grounds. And instead, she requested a drink to be made for her using barley, pennyroyal mint, and water. And this was offered her, and she drank it. And then Metanera put her infant son, Demophon, in Demeter's care. And as soon as the baby saw Demeter, he recognized the divinity in her. He started to glow. He started reaching for her, and he started to grow like a god in her care. And he hardly ever cried. And the baby always stayed with Demeter overnight. And each night, because she was his nursemaid, so he slept with her overnight. And each night, Demeter will put him into a sacred fire. And one night, Queen Metanera was walking by the room, and she heard her son Demophon giggling a lot. And she was wondering why her baby was laughing so much instead of sleeping. And so she opened the door and looked in and saw Demeter holding her son in a blazing fire. You can imagine how she reacted to that. How could she have known that Demeter was actually in the process of making her son into an immortal? And now that the queen had interfered, she'd ruined the whole thing. Demeter was annoyed by her interference, but at least she introduced herself that yes, she's a goddess Demeter. She transformed back into her form as a goddess, and it was so radiant. I'd filled the entire palace with light. And then she ordered the king and the queen to build a temple and an altar by the Callicoron well where she'd been found sitting. And she said I should come back and tell them how to worship her and the secrets of her rites. And then she vanished in a flash of lightning. And they were built there exactly as she had ordered. And by this time, there was a full-blown famine all over the world, because not a single seed that had been planted ever since Demeter went into her grief had grown. The seasons were halted, and without food growing or anything, people were dying, animals were dying. There was a bitter cold that enveloped the whole world, which was now as barren and cold as Demeter felt in her grief. Rivers froze, and without living people or animals or crops, there will be no sacrifices for any of the other gods. And so all the gods on Mount Olympus noticed that they weren't getting any sacrifices. And so it began to dawn on Zeus what he had done. And so Zeus started sending other gods to Demeter one by one, commanding her to come back to Olympus. But she assured all of them that the only way that was ever going to happen was after she had seen her daughter again with her own eyes. He sent all sorts of bribes and gifts and honors, all kinds of promises, and she turned everything down. And then eventually Zeus sent the god Hermes, who's the messenger god, also known as a wonderful trickster who could talk circles around anyone. So Zeus sent Hermes down to the underworld to command Hades to get the daughter Corey back to her mother Persephone. But the girl Corey, having lived in Hades, she had died, and so she would be returning to life as Persephone. She would be reborn, and so Hades obeyed, but he told Persephone that it wasn't so bad being a goddess to one of the wealthiest parts of the earth, and he also convinced her to eat some seeds of a pomegranate. And in her joy at the news that she was going to meet her mom, she ate for the first time. That's the only thing she ate throughout her stay in Hades. And she was ecstatic about being reunited with her mom, obviously. So Hades yoked his horses, his 4 immortal horses, to his chariot, and then handed it over to Hermes, because as the messenger of the gods, he could travel freely between all the worlds. And so he took Persephone on the chariot, and they rode over to the temple where Demeter was waiting. But he couldn't open the doorways himself, but the goddess Hecate, who was the goddess of doorways, opened the doors, and Demeter was reunited with her mom, and they were both overjoyed. So that's the depiction of Hermes bringing Persephone back to her mother. And then Demeter asked Persephone if she had eaten anything while she was in the underworld, and she told her mom she'd eaten the pomegranates. And the implication was that whatever she had eaten was going to keep her bound to the underworld, and so she would have to return to Hades in the underworld. So you'd have to spend 1/3 of the year in the underworld with Hades, and then the remaining 2, because in ancient Greece they only had 3 seasons. So one season, that's winter, should be with her husband in the underworld, and then the remaining 2 seasons, spring and summer, should be with her mother. Not ideal, but they had no choice. They accepted it. And so Demeter restored the fertility of the earth, and the whole world was happy because of the joy of the goddess, and it burst with vegetation and blooming flowers again. And Demeter returned to Eleusis to teach the prominent leaders how to perform her myths, her mysteries, and her rites in her honor. Demeter again. She also taught a man known as Triptolemus about the art of agriculture and how to plant things and all that. And then the 2 goddesses returned to Mount Olympus together. And that's the myth of Demeter. And now we're going to move on to the 3rd part of our presentation, which is the Eleusinian Mysteries. Now, Demeter had a number of cults and festivals honoring her. She was a very powerful goddess. There was a cult known as Thesmophoria, which honored her, but it was women only, and it was a fertility cult popular all over Greece. But all the other cults, they all pale in comparison to the Eleusinian Mysteries, because that one was the Holy of Holies. Now, the father of Greek history, Herodotus, wrote in the 6th century about this festival. Every year, the Athenians celebrate a festival in honor of the mother and the maid, and anyone who wishes from all of Athens and elsewhere may be initiated in the mysteries. So it was open to everybody, male, female, young, old, master or slave, Greek or non-Greek. Everyone was welcome to take part in the mysteries. The only stipulations were that you have to speak and understand Greek, and you must not have killed another human being, because then you were unclean and you're required to go through a cleansing ceremony to atone and wash the blood off your hands. And during the time when the festival was taking place, no one could be arrested for anything. And if someone owed money, the debtors were not allowed to come and collect them at the time when the festivals were taking place. So the Eleusinian Mysteries were rituals that were performed in honor of the mother and daughter goddesses. And they're the most ancient rites in all of Greece. And they shared ritual beliefs with ancient Egypt, with Crete, with Anatolia, and with Thrace, dating as far back as the Neolithic Age. The Neolithic Age is the New Stone Age. It's the age when animals first started living with people, getting domesticated, when pottery was first used by humans, and when humans first started living in permanent settlements and having a farming lifestyle. And the Greeks called these rites ta mysteria, and they were celebrated in Greece for about 2,000 years, probably more, from around 1450 BCE until 392 CE. And they were done twice a year in two distinct stages. And they're considered to be so essential to the very survival of the human race that it was said the life of the Greeks would be unlivable if they were prevented from properly observing the most sacred mysteries that hold the entire human race together. The first stage was known as the Lesser Mysteries, and it took place in the month of Anthesterion, the Festival of Flowers. That's approximately February or March. And this portion of it was done as a preparation, a purification of sorts for the greater mysteries. And it was required to participate in the lesser mysteries in order to gain entry into the greater mysteries, because you had to get purified and atoned to prepare for what you were going to experience during the greater mysteries. So the lesser mysteries, just because everyone was welcome doesn't mean that everyone was allowed to get in. Socrates commented on how the lesser mysteries were necessary in determining who was worthy enough to experience the greater mysteries. And Plutarch wrote that in mystery initiations, one should bear up to the first purifications and unsettling events and hope for something sweet to come out of the present anxiety and confusion. And Plato wrote about them: whoever arrives in Hades as an uninitiate and non-participant in these initiation rites will lie in the mud, but he or she who is purified by initiation will dwell with the gods. So the lesser mysteries are known as Maiasis, and they took place at Agrai on the banks of the Ilissus River in Athens. And the objective here was to teach the initiates the theology of the two goddesses and the meaning of the mysteries, and to prepare them for what they would experience later in the year. And it said that even Hercules, the demigod, had been an initiate of these mysteries, which is why he was able to undertake successfully the 12 labors of Hercules, because he'd been purified, because he had previously killed and he had blood on his hands, but he had atoned. And so the lesser mysteries were done in 3 parts that involved the initiates getting purified by the elements of water, air, and fire. And they were administered by Demeter's priests and priestesses. And these people had the right to prevent anyone from participating at any stage and for any reason. There's a story about a high priest who barred this great magician known as Apollonius from taking part in the mysteries. because he claimed that he could not admit a charlatan into the mysteries, something so pure. And when he said this, Apollonius responded that he knew more about the mysteries than this high priest did, and that he just wanted to come see what the high priest, who is more skilled than he is, would do. And the people who were watching the high priest turn this magician away applauded Apollonius. And so when the high priest saw that his decision was unpopular, he said he would admit Apollonius, but Apollonius refused to get admitted. And he said that he would be admitted in 4 years' time. And he predicted who the high priest would be by that time. And it actually came to happen. So he was a very powerful magician, apparently. So it began with, okay, first of all, I'm going to talk about the priests of Demeter. So there were 4 kinds of priests that she had, and they had their all different ranks. The first was the hierarchs, also the herald. He instructed aspiring initiates, and he was also the official messenger. And so if you were deemed unworthy, this is the priest who would send you away with the words, "Away, away, you profane." And second was the Diadochus, the torchbearer. He administered the purification rites and also confessions and baptism. The third was the Archon Basilius, magistrate, and Epimeleti, the superintendent of the procession. He attended to all matters having to do with ritual sacrifices and with processions of the greater mysteries, as well as praying with people who'd been successfully initiated. And then the highest rank was held by the Hierophant, the high priest, the displayer of holy objects. This top rank was given to someone who was considered a representative of the creator God, was elected into the position, and he held it for life. And he was always an older man from an ancient family and had to be a person of high culture with perfect in mind and soul and other very strict requirements. And most of the people who were elected into this position were philosophers. And there's speculation that these rituals may have taken place in these lesser mysteries or in the greater ones. No one really knows, but it began with an offering to Persephone that was done on a low altar known as Eshkara. And so first a pig was sacrificed on the altar, and then a stack of round cakes known as pelonoi were offered. And then the priest poured a libation onto the altar and also presented an offering with a tray full of unknown objects, which he placed on the altar. And there were poppy flowers said to be in this tray of unknown objects. And after this part of the ceremony, the initiate was told of certain myths, which Socrates said are inappropriate to tell before children. And then next, the initiate was made to sit on a chair that was covered with fleece of a ram. And then a priestess of Demeter would blindfold the initiate and also drape a cloth over the initiate's head to make the person enter into darkness. And then the person was led by the priestess through a series of unknown tests or sufferings that involved fire and the torches that were at the altar. And then next, the priest used a winnowing fan known as a lignon, which he held over the head of the initiate. And a lignon is a winnowing fan used for sieving wheat that has been harvested. And so it was used to separate the wheat from the chaff. And this, the connection to Demeter and its symbolism was like separation of the worthy from the unworthy. And so there was also fasting, bathing in the waters of the Ilissos River, dancing with sacred vessels, sprinkling of waters from the Ilissos River, And when all this was done, the person was considered purified and expected to live a pure life until the greater mysteries, which will take place later in the year. And the lesser mysteries were more associated with Persephone, which is why they were held in the springtime. And now we come to the greater mysteries. So these ones were done later in the year. And in the month before they began, around mid-August or so, special messengers known as spondiphora were sent out from Eleusinian and Athens all over Greece to invite Demeter's worshippers to the ceremonies that would begin the following month. And when these spondiphora arrived in a town or village, they would pour out a libation of peace in that town, which meant that all the inhabitants were meant to adhere to a 2-month truce of peace. And this ensured that all travelers from all over Greece and all over wherever they're coming from were able to get safe passage to Athens and Eleusinian. And people actually stuck to these truces, which lasted about 55 days. And then the greater mysteries lasted 9 days each year. And each day of the greater mysteries technically began after sunset. So they were held at night by torchlight. And they only started after the appearance of the first star in the night sky. And they were done at nighttime because for the duration of the rituals, it was said that the goddesses appeared to people in their dreams and gave them messages in their dreams. And so on the eve of day 1, which happened on the 14th day of the month of Boedromion, which was approximately September, the priestesses of Demeter and Persephone, they carried these covered baskets that contained the sacred objects or hiera of the goddesses in those baskets. And they carried these objects in those baskets on their heads. And they walked from Demeter's temple in Eleusis to Athens. And they were accompanied by an honor guard sent by the emperor. And so they walked along the sacred way, or the hieros odos. The sacred way was once the only paved road in ancient Greece. It was about 19 kilometers long, and it was the only road that connected Eleusis and Attica and Peloponnesus. And it was along this road, there were many countless sanctuaries and tombs and monuments to other gods. Even the temple of Aphrodite was along this road. And this is also the road that led to the Oracle of Delphi. And it was along this road that the procession marched to the Temple of Demeter. And this road was so important in ancient Greece that only the priests of the Temple of Persephone and Demeter were allowed to do any maintenance work on it or to repair it or anything. And so along the way, these priestesses, they always stopped by a shrine near Demeter's fig tree. The story of the fig tree is that while Demeter was wandering the earth looking for her daughter, she met a man known as Philetus from the town of Eleusis. He received the goddess into his home and he treated her with such great hospitality that she created the first fig tree ever and gave it to him as a gift. And so a shrine was built there in her honor. And by the time the procession reached Athens, there will be huge crowds waiting to welcome them to Athens. And then a priest of Demeter would climb up onto the Acropolis. What's the Acropolis? and announce the arrival of Demeter's sacred objects and the arrival of her entourage to the priestess of Athena. Why Athena? Because in addition to being the goddess of wisdom, Athena was also the patron goddess of Athens. And so by announcing this to the goddess of Athena, this was a way of showing mutual respect to both the goddesses and to the people of both regions of Greece. And so day one, the following day of the ritual was known as Agirmos, or the gathering. And so the initiates, known as Mistai, were dressed very simply, and they assembled at the Agora, also known as the Athenian marketplace, in front of the Stoa Poikile, the painted portico. And after they had all gathered around in their thousands, the priests and priestesses would invoke the blessings of Zeus, of Athena, of Demeter, and Persephone to begin the festivities officially. Then the officiating priest of the rituals was required to have an excellent singing voice, because the vocal parts of the rituals, known as the proclamations or proresis of the ritual, had to be done with perfect intonation in order to have any efficacy. And it was said that the human voice is preeminently a magical instrument without which none of the highest operations of art can succeed. Each of its utterances is carried into the region of the invisible, where it releases forces of which people are completely unaware. And so the proclamation made by the priest to declare the ritual open, or the teleiete, the proclamation was known as, he said, I quote, "Everyone who has clean hands and intelligible speech, who is pure from all pollution, whose soul is conscious of no evil, and who has lived well and justly, is permitted to proceed into the mysteries." And then after this proclamation, all the people who were present took a vow of silence and secrecy right then and there. They were forbidden from disclosing any secret of the rituals by Athenian law on pain of death. That's why till this day, despite thousands of people who participated over a period of more than 2,000 years, we still don't know exactly what happened. Because even the philosophers we hear from, they only talk around it. They never mention what actually happened. And it's also remarkable because these ancient cities were very, very chatty places. People gossiped a lot, and yet somehow they managed to keep these things secret. And so the initiates, or Mistai, they were expected to fast from dawn until dusk every day of the festival, just as Demeter hadn't eaten anything while she was looking for her daughter, Persephone. So after sunset on day one, they ate, but they were forbidden from consuming any meat, any red mullet fish, any red wine, pomegranates, apples, and beans. And after dinner on the first evening, the priestesses and the people would hold a procession where they walk through the streets of Athens, singing and dancing. And then it was that night that the sacred objects of Demeter will get placed into her temple in Athens. And then they slept that night. And the second day was known as Eleusis, letting go, banishment. So on the morning of day two, the priest began the day with shouts of Alade Mistai, which meant to the sea, initiates. So this day was a day when the initiates were supposed to go and take a ritual bath in the sea to cleanse themselves. And so they all went and immersed themselves in the sea. And this took place on the Bay of Phaleron. Each initiate also took a suckling pig, a piglet about 2 to 6 weeks old, along with them to bathe in the sea, and they purified not just themselves, but also these piglets. Bathing in the sea was like returning to the womb of Mother Earth, and sea salt was believed to heal, but also to wash clean all the foulness of mankind. And so pigs were a part of the ritual because of the swine at, what in the myth, the kidnapping of Persephone. There was a swineherd named Eubulus who was grazing his pigs on the plain of Nysa when she was abducted, and some of his pigs were swallowed up into the same chasm as Persephone, and so they're part of the ritual. And so there was one piglet for each initiate, and they all dipped the piglets into the Aegean Sea to purify them. And also pigs were supposedly known for absorbing the evil of human beings, the poor things. Now on day 3, the third day, known as Hieria Duro, the day of sacred offerings. So offerings were made to the two goddesses. And it was on this day that each of the initiates sacrificed those piglets they purified to the goddesses. So each of the piglets was killed and buried in a pit. And it was a symbolic killing, it's a symbolic death of the sins of the initiate, which had been transferred into the pigs. And so there were also offerings of grain and fruit given. And then there were official delegations from various cities. They also brought offerings from those regions, usually the first fruits of the harvest. And then at night, there was a feast with dancing and singing and thanksgiving. And at this feast, they ate cakes made of honey and sesame. Day 4, or Asclepius or Epidaura, named in honor of the god Asclepius, the god of medicine. And on this 4th night, the members of the cult of Asclepius, as well as Hygeia, the goddess of health, joined the festivities at Demeter's temple, because all 4 gods, all 4 deities, including Demeter and Persephone, Hygeia and Asclepius, were said to have healing powers. And so on this night of the ritual, they invoked special prayers for blessing doctors and healers, and people who were suffering from any illnesses or emotional or spiritual distress were called and their healing practices done. Afterwards, there was a night watch done, which involved dream incubation. They slept in a small cave that had a sacred spring in it. And this cave also contained a dormitory known as an abaton. And there were ritual techniques used to make the people dream about specific things. And they were able to invite specific gods or goddesses into their dreams. And so that god or goddess would come into the dream and heal you or tell you what you wanted, the answer to your prayer. If you wanted wealth, that was what you got. They told you how to do it. And then after that night, the following morning, the initiates were expected to tell their dreams to the attendants of Asclepius or Hygeia. And these attendants were known as therapeutes, what we call therapists today. And they helped them to interpret the meaning of the dreams and gave them the directions of what they were expected to do next to get the answers to their prayers. And then day 5, known as Pomp. This was the most major day of the celebration in Athens. And on this day, Athens was said to be more crowded than any other part of Greece. And there were more than 30,000 people who came to Athens just to watch, even if they weren't taking part in the rituals themselves. And only once in over 2,000 years of this rituals was the pomp celebration ever cancelled. And this was in the year 335 BC, when the news was was received that Alexander the Great had destroyed the city state of Thebes, which was the strongest Greek city state at the time. So now what happened on day 5? Thousands of exuberant celebrants joined in with the grand procession from Athens to Eleusis. The priestess of Demeter always led the procession. And so early in the morning, they took Demeter's sacred things and carried them on their heads. And then all the Mysti who wore myrtle leaves woven into their hair, wore them like crowns on their heads. And they all joined the procession. And they also held a myrtle branch known as a Bacchus in their hands. And they departed Athens through the sacred gate and onto the sacred way. They made frequent stops along the way and at various altars, and poured libation or made sacrifices. And the first stop was right at the sacred gate of Athens, where they invoked Iacchos, the sacred son, and an attendant of Demeter. He was known as the leader-in-chief of the Eleusinian Mysteries, and he was a demigod who was called to help lead them in the rituals they were going to perform. They made various sacrifices along the way. They had ritual baths and they poured libation. So they also paused at the river Kephisos, where the youth amongst them offered locks of their hair as a sacrifice. And then the procession rested at Daphne, at the temple precinct of the gods Apollo, Demeter, Persephone, and Athena. And this place was also very close to where the sanctuary of Aphrodite was located. Aphrodite, of course, the goddess of love, laughter, and beauty. And so they went to her sanctuary and they lit candles and left votive offerings for her. And then they continued on. And when they got to the boundary between Athens and Eleusis, they also stopped beside the a lake known as Rhetua, where they were met by the descendants of Crocus, who were the first inhabitants of that part of Greece. And these inhabitants came and met them, and they tied saffron yellow strands on their right wrist and on their left ankles of each initiate. And this was a signal of their connection to the mother goddess. And then just outside of Eleusis, the initiates had to stop at a place known as the Bridge of Jests. So they crossed this bridge, and there was part of a hazing initiation done here, where people dressed in masks mocked and teased them relentlessly. And some of the insults were very, very personal. This is supposed to be some sort of tribute to that goddess Iambe, who was the first person to make the goddess Demeter laugh while she was looking for her daughter. Anyway, and so following this, they finally got to Demeter's sanctuary at Eleusis. They typically arrived at midnight, bearing torches and laughing and dancing and singing. So they're depicted holding all the torches. And then day 6, known as Panicus, or night-long revelry, we began on the evening of day 6 with a torchlit dance, which was done by the well, the Callicharon, that well where Demeter sat under the olive tree. It's also known as the Well of Beautiful Dances. And one of the most significant dances done was known as the Kernophoria, a special dance that was led by the women carrying the first fruits of the harvest in a ritual vessel called a kernos on top of their heads. And then other celebrants joined in with the dancing. They made sacred offerings of bread known as pelanos, and the dancing lasted all night. And then the initiates rested during the following morning from the all-night revelry, but they continued to make dedications and sacrifices to all the minor gods in the Greek pantheon throughout the day. Now we come to days 7 and 8, which are known as Mysteriotides Nictes, the mythical nights, or the night of the mysteries. They're the most sacred nights and the most secret. We don't know what actually happened. We know that they lasted for those 2 nights, and they were done in the Telesterion, in the huge hall. So they entered Demeter's temple using a secret password that had been given to them by the high priest, and they entered the Telesterion, where there was incense burning inside. We know that they drank a beverage known as kykion, which is a sacred drink of the gods. It's known as a communion drink, and it was made from barley, pennyroyal mint, and water, and said to be sweetened with honey. There's speculation that it contained ergot, a kind of hallucinogenic fungus that is similar to LSD. I don't know, I've never drank kykion. And then we also know that there were 3 main elements to the secret rituals that were done in the Telesterion: the dromena, things done; the legomena, things spoken; and the dikneumena, the things seen or things shown. But thanks to the vow of secrecy, none of these things have ever been revealed. We don't know what they are. But we just know what all of the Greek philosophers say about this, those who are initiated into the cult. So they only talked about it. Pindar wrote of them: "Blessed is the individual who dies after seeing these things, for then such a person knows not only life's purpose, but also its divine origin as well." Plato said, "The ultimate goal of the mysteries was to lead us back to the principles from which we descended, a perfect enjoyment of intellectual spiritual good. Death is not the end of one's life, but only the beginning of another part of the journey." Our mysteries had a very real meaning. He that has been purified and initiated shall dwell with the gods. Plutarch wrote, "Because of these sacred and faithful promises given in the mysteries, we hold it firmly for an undoubted truth that our soul is incorruptible and immortal. Let us act accordingly." And he went on to say, "When a man dies, he is like those who are initiated into these mysteries. Our whole life is a journey by tortuous ways without outlet. At the moment of death comes terror, shuddering fear, amazement, and then a wonderful light that moves to meet you, pure meadows that receive you, songs, dances, and holy apparitions." And then Cicero, the Italian philosopher from Rome, he was initiated at the age of 18, and he wrote about it. "For among the many excellent and indeed divine institutions which your Athens has brought forth and has contributed to human life, none, in my opinion, is better than these Eleusinian mysteries. For by their means, we have been brought out of our barbarous and savage mode of life and educated and refined to a state of civilization. And as the rites are called initiations, so in very truth, we have learned from them the very beginnings of life and have gained the power not only to live happily, but also to die with a better hope." Socrates: "Those who established these initiations for us were not trivial, but in reality, long ago hinted that whoever arrives in Hades uninitiated and unaccomplished will lie in the mud, but the cleansed and perfected, arriving there, will dwell with the gods. For there are, as they say in the mysterious rituals, many thyrsus bearers, but few mystics. And then Phaedo, who was present when Socrates was sentenced to death, and who was there when he was executed they made him drink poison. He makes this comment about Socrates' demeanor when he was dying and his fearlessness. I really felt strange being with him, for while being present at the death of my companion, I did not feel pity, for the man appeared happy to me, both in manner and his words, since he was dying fearlessly and nobly, so that it came over to me that he was not going to Hades without there being divine providence. Arriving there, he would do well. And so the highest stage of the initiation was known as the epopteia, and it was described as a vision or special state of seeing, which was received by the initiates inside the temple. And it said that many of the mysti were profoundly shocked and completely transformed by what they saw, and that they completely lost the fear of death. And speculation abounds that they may have had a near-death experience, and we don't know what they saw. We don't know whether they had hallucinogenic visions with from what they drank. But what we know about it from what they talk about is that they experienced some sort of death and rebirth, just like Persephone did. And it was described as a transcendental experience with profound after effects. They learned that death was only an illusion because they had experienced it themselves in a way. And so, having faced the biggest fear of all living creatures, they got to come back convinced that there was actually nothing to fear. And the experience induced a feeling that was ineffable and overwhelming. And it's believed by some that they also saw visions of Persephone. And so after the rituals of those 2 days and the nights of secrecy, each of the mysti was crowned with a chaplet of flowers and ribbons as confirmation that they had been adopted by the goddess Demeter. And upon completion of the rituals, they were known as epoptai, which means beholder or eyewitness. And then day 9 is known as phlemokai and epistrophe. And so on day 9, they came out from the Telesterian hall, and it was a day of libations or return, a day of pouring of plenty. And so special ritual vessels known as phlemokai were used to pour out libations in honor of their ancestors and the Demetrioi, the people of Demeter, the day of honoring the dead, and also giving thanks for the abundant harvest. And there was a lot of dancing done. And then after most of the morning, they had the epistrophe rituals, which implied that they were returning, the crossing back over from the liminal in-between realm of the sacred rituals and the ordinariness of everyday life. And then the initiates danced in a field outside of where they had performed all the rituals. And then they returned to Athens, where they had traveled from. And then after the 2-month truce had ended, anybody who had disturbed the peace during the truce was severely punished by the Supreme Court. And then anybody who had ever attempted to reveal any secrets of the rituals were sentenced to death. There's the ones we know about are Alcibiades and his friends who were, they didn't even talk about it. They acted it out, and they were sentenced to death in absentia because they knew what was coming. So they fled from Greece, but they are still sentenced to death in absentia. And then in 415 BC, a group of young lads were merely suspected of having mocked the rituals, and the Athenian law was temporarily changed to allow that anyone, including slaves who knew anything about the people who had done it, could come back and reveal their identities and whereabouts. And this is significant because at this time, slaves were nothing, they had no rights. But in this instance, the word of a slave would be admissible, even if the slave was reporting their master. Then how did they end? They ended in the year 392. That's when the rituals got shut down by the Christian emperor Theodosius. This was because he was a Christian emperor, and he believed that these pagan practices were at odds with his truth of Christianity. And so most of the former sites of the rituals were converted into Christian churches, or they're just completely abandoned. And then in the year 396 BC, Alaric, the king of the Goths, decided that it wasn't enough to just stop the rituals. He decided to destroy them all. So he leveled all the temples and all the holy sites, just leaving rubble and ruin in his wake. We'll look at a few pictures of the ruins of what they look like today. So this was what the Telesterian Temple of Demeter looked, well, you can see what's left of it. It was a massive building. Another view of the excavation site. This is supposed to be the entrance into the hall. So apparently the Telesterion was behind here. So they climbed up these stairs and into the Telesterion. Then this gate was known as the Plutonian Gate, or entrance into the Underworld. Of course, it was also destroyed. This is a 1955 photograph of the ruins at Eleusis, or Eleusina as it's called now. This is a drawing of the scale of what it may have looked like of the sanctuary of Demeter at Eleusis may have looked. It's a massive building. And this is a depiction of the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone, and presumably Hermes or whoever brought her back from the underworld. It's a bigger version of that. And then these are the names of the month of ancient Greece. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce them. This is what they were called, and this is what they are now, approximately, in our Gregorian calendar. And this is a depiction of a priestess of Demeter during a ritual. I don't know how true it is. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you all very much. And now I'm going to stop recording so we can have a discussion or question and answer session if you want.